Hi. Thanks for stopping by. I'm Angel, and I recently realized I'm autistic. I'm 51, and just a little over a month ago, my whole life, I'm making this motion because it was like dominoes cascading backwards and forwards through my whole life. This realization that I'm autistic. And some of the major catalysts for this realization have been meltdowns, rage, and various consequences of that in my life, including dissolving of relationships, employment, bodily functions, um, and increasingly, an inability to manage my own life. And finally, after a series of accusations by people closest to me, I realized that I'm autistic, and I'm still been processing that. But I was earlier, I made another video about meltdowns. This was really one of the most significant symptoms of autism that led me to realize that I'm autistic. And in thinking about mini and mega meltdowns, as I've been calling them, I, I, I think that the most significant aspect that might be helpful to discuss or to bring more awareness to is the level of emotion that I feel and that I believe many people who are autistic feel leads to, it's not just emotion, like the level of emotion is proportional to the level of stimulus coming in, not just from the outside but from the inside as well. I'm very um, perceptive of a lot of my bodily functions, a lot of energy. That said, I also am quite good at numbing myself and tuning it out, so I'm not always perceptive at all. But I am just recently realizing that even though I block it out and mask, as it's often called, there's still an accumulation of data happening in my body that tends to lead to micro, mini, and mega major meltdowns in my life. And my mother recently accused me of being emotionally manipulative. This was one of the key triggers to my realization at a time when I was melting down, and I was, as I have been frequently, very wounded by that, because there's nothing like feeling wounded and then having somebody that you love come around and start basically kicking you psychologically, which is what it feels like, and telling you that it's your fault and that you should stop. As you can see from my emotionality, this is still a very sensitive subject for me, and probably always will be. It's been very ingrained in me. But one of the most profound realizations for me in all of this has been how much of the suffering that I have done and how much of the struggling that people that I've had relationships with have done around this lack of understanding about meltdowns. And without that understanding, a meltdown can seem like emotional manipulation. It can seem like passive aggressiveness. It can seem like just craziness. It seems like, people with autism are frequently misdiagnosed with personality disorders, ADHD, compulsive disorders, all sorts of things, some of which do coincide, but often those diagnoses are often misinterpretations of what are collectively quite textbook autism symptoms. And probably especially for me, the most profound, biggest one of those, at least at this point in my processing of this realization, is that emotional meltdown component. And it's ironic to me that my mother, I believe, is autistic, although she has not, just she has not put that label on herself, or expressed any interest in doing so since I brought it up recently. But nonetheless, in my own realization that I'm autistic, I've realized that my mother is pretty certainly, at least from my perspective, autistic. And I also think my last partner was also autistic. And partly that's why we connect so profoundly. I have an ability, I'm very empathic. I think many people with autism are, again, if we haven't like had to shut it down due to hypersensitivity. Um, but this meltdown aspect that I experience as uncontrollable crying most frequently, I have other ways that I experience it as well. Sometimes a shutdown, but more often it's more of an externalized, like an external meltdown. And I think that many autistic people, including my mother and my former partner, experience a similar but exactly opposite internal meltdown, which we might describe as a shutdown. I do think the thinking of it as like an internal process or an external process is a helpful way for me to think about it. And when I look at myself and my relationships, especially with those most recent dissolvings, breakdowns, complete traumatizing uh, aspects of my trying to interrelate with humans, it's very helpful for me to start to understand meltdowns and shutdowns versus manipulation and aggression. In both directions, I can see how other people have taken my meltdowns personally and how that comes across as manipulative and passive aggressive from the outside, and how in many cases the end result is that, regardless of my intention. And so how that naturally does create real problems in my relationships. And also how the shutdowns that my counterparts in relationship are exemplifying or experiencing at times, or were experiencing in our interactions, I believe they were not aware that that's, if in the same way that I haven't been aware that I've been having as we're calling it, autistic meltdowns. It's just a label, it's just a name, but it's helpful in this context, I think, to have that label, that name, that container to put it in. And without that label, that container, then people who shut down internally, the examples I'm thinking of, and I could be totally off base. Let me just pause and put a pinky finger asterisk to acknowledge. I'm just processing out loud here, which is something that I find helpful to do. I'm sharing because I find it helpful to hear other people's processing. It helps me in mine. But I am as fallible and imperfect as every other being. And so there's a good chance I have some or all of this wrong. So perhaps, the people I'm speaking of are not autistic, and perhaps they really are just right, and they're setting boundaries and they're withdrawing because they are responding to their perception of me, or of something else being wrong, or inappropriate, or not serving them well. And so I can relate to that. I think that is a healthy mechanism to set a boundary, to keep yourself well, and to protect yourself from too much outside drama. But I don't think that that is always what it's been. And again, I could be wrong, and it doesn't really matter, I know, to you. It's just my own internal process. And the point that might matter to someone else like you is that I think some of the time I've been aware that I've been melting down. I didn't know it was autism, but I knew that it was an out of my control overwhelmed response. And then other times when people have accused me of being manipulative, like my mother did a month and a half or so ago, um, and much more often when I was a child, if not externally, internally. Here's the thing: I think often people don't accuse out loud or externally, but they respond as if they were accusing. And so people often withdraw from me because they feel like I'm being manipulative or too intense or not regulating my emotions well. And that's, not regulating my emotions well is a fair accusation and can be dangerous in some situations. To be fair, I'm actually usually quite good in emergencies and dangerous situations. Um, which is probably one of those things that's confusing to people when I say, not just claim, but when I find myself unable to regulate my emotions in some situations, that it's often in a very minorly stressful situation, not an emergency, but just like I'm remembering one time I was frustrated because I couldn't articulate a question to a teacher in a biology lab, and I melted down, mini meltdown. These, I have many memories of these kind of meltdowns, again, like dominoes going back through my life. But paired with those are often these traumatic experiences of the way that then people have responded to me. And a lot of that has to do with a lack of awareness of autism. So I guess that's the bottom line. The punchline that I'm trying to get to is, I think the more that we become aware of autism, or neurodivergence, I'm a little hesitant around the terminology still. The terminology is ever evolving and often does as much harm as it does good, or, more one than the other. So I think it's important to remember terminology. Words are just things that point at things. They're useful often, but they're not actually they're not, let's only use them when they're useful. That's what I'm trying to spit out. I'd love it if you have any input. Clearly, I'm stumbling through some stuff here. I'm very happy to see my kitty friend, Sappy Cat. She's been missing in the heat all afternoon. Clearly, she was just catnapping like cats do. Anyway, let me know what you think. Do you ever have meltdowns or shutdowns? Are you autistic or are you neurotypical and still have them? I think that's a conversation that I would like to dive into a little bit more. And or do you have relationships, or have you had a relationship with anyone who you thought was being emotionally manipulative, who you might, if you look at through the lens of autism or meltdowns, a sensory overload, inability to cope, that you might take what seemed like manipulation to be more of a just simple inability, and then it might be easier to not take it so personally or be offended by it or even be so judgmental and critical about it. That's what I've got to say about that. I welcome your questions, comments. I'd like to remind you, whatever labels you do or don't put on you, you are worthy of your own unconditional love. You're as worthy as every other tiny, shiny speck of life, of enjoying your life, enjoying being you. So I really hope you're doing that today. I'm really grateful if you check out the description and click on any of those links that help support me. I've got affiliate links. I've got books and music and courses, art. Check it out. Thank you if you do. Leave me a comment, subscribe, all the things and stuff. And above and beyond all else, stay free.